Hey there, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. So you've been listening to me talk a lot recently. I've talked about the stuff I carry on day trips, the stuff I wear for summer and fall trips into the backcountry, the guiding principles of backcountry fly fishing, and then a number of other things that are just sort of level sets for us. And there's going to be a little bit more of that. I have a few more things I want to cover to talk about kind of my fishing system, the way I fish, the places I like to fish, just so we're all kind of on the same page as we start getting into more detailed information. But I know that you might need a break from just listening to me. I also know there are a lot of really interesting people and organizations involved in this crazy backcountry fly fishing thing that we do. And so I also want to take the chance when I have it to have those folks on the show to share their knowledge and their experience and just talk to us a little bit about what they do and how they interface with the sport of fly fishing and specifically with backcountry fly fishing. So today we've got a couple of guests, both from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. For those who don't know and who aren't from Colorado, this is the state division that is in charge of pretty much everything related to fishing. They also handle a bunch of other stuff related to hunting and wildlife and a bunch of other things. But for our purposes, they are the fishing guys. And we are specifically going to be talking to a couple of aquatic biologists with CPW. One's name is Ben Swigle. He's been doing it for more than 20 years and really has a ton of experience in this area. And then we also have Gage Dean, who, in addition to having one of the coolest names in history, is another aquatic biologist, this time the guy who is tasked with actually trekking to these lakes with teams to get measurements about how deep they are, check the water quality, check on the fish and see which fish are in there, so actually survey the lakes and the fish populations. And he is really, really deeply involved in being in the backcountry, going to these lakes and understanding them. And really both of them help us learn a lot more specifically about how the fish that we love to catch, in this case, most cases, cutthroat, although we will talk a little bit about brook trout and some others, how they get into those lakes. Why are they there? Why were they stocked in the first place? How does CPW decide where they're going to stock those fish? And what can we as anglers do to find these lakes, to get to them, to catch these fish, and to really do well at understanding the ecosystem and these lakes that we love to hike to, these incredibly beautiful places that we love to go to fly fish. It's a really interesting conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. And so without further ado, let's jump in. All right. So our guests today are Ben Swigle and Gage Dean. They are both aquatic biologists with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They're here to talk to us about High-Alpine lakes and what goes into getting those things stocked, how they check on the health of the fish, the history of it, and just how that stuff works. I get a lot of questions from folks about how exactly fish got into those lakes, which lakes they should fish, what kinds of fish are in each lake. And these guys are the resident experts. So we're happy to have you with us, and thanks for hopping on.
Yeah, our pleasure, Ross.
Awesome. So, Ben, I wonder if you could start by just introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about your work with CPW, how long you've been there, and how day-to-day life looks for you as an aquatic biologist.
Well, I've been with Colorado Parks and Wildlife since 2005. I serve as an area aquatic biologist. I started out in brush on the Eastern Plains and then moved to the Fort Collins area in 2010. We're kind of divided into regions. We're located out of the Northeast region. And within that region, there's 8 to 9 wildlife officers and 1 aquatic biologist. I have the pleasure of overseeing upwards of 700 different waters, streams, rivers, lakes, and reservoirs in my particular area, and we manage those for the benefit of the public angler. And we do a variety of surveys, from electrofishing to gill netting to seining to creel surveys, where we interview anglers. We're responsible for regulation changes. The aquatic biologist is also responsible for coordinating what species and how many from one of our 23 different hatcheries. And we also hire seasonal employees to help us get all of our field work done. And we also do a variety of spawning operations and just anything aquatic, we usually have our hands in.
Very cool. And Gage, what about you? Same story and same title, but I bet your job looks a little bit different.
Yeah, definitely a little different. I've been working with Ben for the last 4 years now. Ben and the other aquatic biologists that are working out of this Fort Collins office. But yeah, I've been working on sampling and assisting with all the sampling for all these reservoirs, lakes, streams, all that. And then last year, I was specifically leading a backcountry sampling crew to sample all the alpine lakes within 2 areas in the Northeast region. So Ben manages one area, and then the other area biologist in Fort Collins manages the other. And so we've really just been focusing on trying to hit most of those alpine lakes for each biologist.
Okay, so tell me how you become an aquatic biologist? So how did you guys get into this, right? Because you're kind of living the dream a little bit, being able to hike up to these lakes and catch the fish and survey the fish and just work on fish all the time. How'd you get started?
I think generally it just began with a passion as an angler for fishing at a young age, and that kind of snowballed into college, where I just got into science classes and got into some ichthyology classes, and realized there was actually coursework directly related to fisheries, which I had no clue you could actually do when you got to school. And just following my passion for fishing, that evolved into what I found as a career that I could actually do this full time. I started as a technician, working seasonal employment. I went back to graduate school, got a master's degree. One thing I'll tell anybody that's interested in doing fishery science as a career is it's kind of hard to choose your location. You got to be kind of willing to bounce around and to find that first full-time job. But once you get in and you do good work, you kind of can start picking the particular type of fish you want to work on, whether that be cold water, warm water, trout, salmon, walleye, bass. But that's kind of how I got started, and it worked out for me location-wise. This is where I want to be, and I get to survey a variety of different species.
Yeah, and I would echo so much of that, and I think so many people in this field would too, is that just like that strong passion for angling, the fish outdoors as at a young age, and then getting into school and being like getting these classes and being like, man, people do this for a living, like they get to go out to do this and get paid for it. And I took those classes, got through all that, and I graduated from Colorado State University with my bachelor's in fish, wildlife, and conservation biology. And that really led to a lot of connections with CPW, between CSU and CPW, and led me into these positions. And since graduating, I haven't felt like I've worked a single day. It's all just been a blast to be able to do what we do and, do some of this great work and not feel like we're working a day at all. So it's pretty awesome to be here.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I'm pretty jealous, man. That's considerably more interesting and probably a lot more fun than my day job. So you guys are, I should have done that when I was younger. All right, so let me ask you this, and I think Ben, you might have alluded to it a little bit earlier on, but sometimes folks wonder why there are fish in these lakes and how they got there, right? I mean, I think there's an assumption that these fish have always been in the lakes. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's not always the case, but tell me a little bit about why CPW stocks the lakes and how they stock the lakes. How do the fish get in there?
Some of the history, quite honestly, Ross, this began at the turn of the century with miners and early homesteaders. They were carrying milk cans of trout up into these high mountain lakes, which is kind of how we ended up with a convoluted set of different species and different genetics, because they're going back and forth across the Continental Divide. They were bringing brook trout from the East Coast. They were bringing rainbow trout from California. They were bringing brown trout from Germany. So we kind of ended up with a cornucopia of a variety of fish species in these lakes. But as you know, or most anglers know, trout don't reproduce very well unless there's a stream component. So in order for the fish to be maintained in our high mountain lakes, repetitive stocking is necessary. So we kind of continued with the milk cans and strapping fish to donkeys and horses until like the late 70s, and then in the 80s we upgraded and we went aerial. Now the vast majority of our high mountain lakes are stocked using a Cessna, an airplane that has a variety of bomb doors, and each particular bomb door or container corresponds to a particular lake that the biologists have looked at previously and determined the stocking rate and how many particular fish we want to be dropped into each particular lake. But it's really become the most efficient way of getting fish into our high mountain lakes. Or traditionally, I imagine our ancestors could do one lake a week. We can do 30, 40 lakes one day. The fish aren't big when they go in, but it's a numbers game. But yeah, we've really rely heavily on CPW pilots to maintain these fish in the high mountain lakes.
All right, so some people find that kind of crazy that you load airplanes up with these little fingerling trout and you fly up to these lakes. And so help me understand kind of how this works. Like, how do you select the lakes? And then when you're the pilot who's flying up there, I mean, are they some of these lakes that I hike to on a regular basis? I mean, they are, 12,000 feet, sometimes even higher. They're up in these crazy, rocky sort of cirques that are, I presume, pretty tough to get into with an airplane. Are they dive bombing them and dropping the fish in? Like, how does this work in practice?
We have a very talented set of pilots in our fleet. I mean, most of their work is what they're doing is terrestrial counts for elk, deer, antelope, moose, wildlife. But I'd say 15 to 20% of their work is on the aquatic side. But yeah, they use the Cessnas are relatively light. They fly alone, so we don't take any passengers to reduce risk. They're very selective on the particular day that they go up into these high mountain lakes. And most of this goes into the planning and the route and just the experience of our pilots knowing each particular lake and their previous notes from our predecessors that this lake you may need to do a dive bomb, or this lake is going to be an easy dump. Approach this lake from the west, or look out for updraft. There's just historical notes that go into it, and they just become more experienced over the years on the individual lakes.
I guess I'm curious how you decide which lakes you stock. So, I mean, they fly up there once you've presumably, I guess, got a list, which fish you're going to put in there. I mean, some of these lakes are pretty remote, and I think it's awesome that you're stocking them really for the benefit of crazy anglers who like to hike up to them and try to catch those fish on a fly rod. But how do you pick the lakes? I mean, you look at them on a map? Do you hike to them first? What's the process for how you kind of build out?
It's a combination. And a great deal of it has to do with what Gage completed the last 2 years. It's the surveys of what's in there. In the 60s and 70s, our biologists collected data on these lakes, bathymetrics, max depth, dissolved oxygen, pH, other water chemistry parameters. We know whether or not a particular lake will winter kill, freeze solid, whether it'll support cutthroat. Maybe it only supports brook trout. But there's a lot of environmental and biological factors that go into it that we have historical data, but we also try and monitor, on a annual or semi-annual basis to make sure we're being the most efficient with the limited resource of fish that we have.
So, Gage, you're the guy who gets tasked with hiking up to these things and looking at them, presumably to kind of take all these measurements.
Yeah.
How do you know, for instance, like winter kill is a great point, Ben? I often wonder, sometimes I'll go to a lake, like I get there a little bit earlier in the season than I probably should have. I don't see any fish. I don't catch anything. and I leave telling myself to make me feel better that it must have winter killed and all the fish are gone, even though I know that's probably not true. It's interesting to me that you're thinking about that as you stock the lakes. What kind of measurements are you taking to check on, winter kill chance, or which lakes would be better for which species? How do you determine that?
So one big thing that we do is it's called a fish deeper sonar. It's a castable sonar that we can bring out there to kind of get a bathymetric map of a lake. That's huge. It's just getting us the maximum depth of a lake. So if we can see that this lake is at least 12-foot max depth, there's a decent probability that fish could survive over winter. And then really what we're looking for, so if we can look back and see on our database how recently it had been stocked. So if this lake has been stocked every other year and we go out there and we set a gill net to sample the fish and we don't get any fish, that can be a great indicator of that. Like, there's been fish going in here every other year for the last 10 years and we just put a net in and didn't see a single fish. So really just, the obvious stuff there, setting the net and seeing what we get in it is huge on that.
And what the net really does is eliminate the variation between, Gage is a really good angler, and I hear you're pretty good, but I'm not. So it takes the guesswork out of it, and not only because the gill net doesn't lie, it catches a variety of year classes, so we can evaluate year class strength. Do we have 1-year-old fish? Did the fish that we stocked 4 years ago survive? So we bring in a net, sometimes 2 or 3, and we'll set a net 1 per lake. And we also hike in a belly boat. So what we do is we set this 150-foot gill net from shore using the fins in the belly boat, and we'll fish it overnight, camp, and supplement with angling. Frankly, sometimes we literally don't catch anything, but we'll wake up the next morning and it'll be, 30, 40 cutthroat in there, or 30 cutthroat and 10 brook trout. But it really reduces the variability. And then we're also able to compare lakes. What's our catch per unit effort for Crater Lake North versus Crater Lake South? Is that variability related to stocking density? Can we change our stocking density to reach a particular goal? Maybe we should manage this lake as a trophy cutthroat fishery. In that case, where we would reduce the stocking. Or maybe we think we can push a lake further because some of the fish we collected, they were just plumb full of scuds. Maybe we can push the fishery a little bit further, but it all kind of relies on carrying in these heavy packs with the gill nets and collecting the fish. And then what we do is each morning we weigh and measure everything we catch. We come up with a condition factor. We can tell whether or not the forage is limited in the lake. And then also, like I say, collect the variety of water quality parameters and develop a stocking plan and a strategy following those surveys.
So are the lakes really managed specifically for angling? So when you're talking about creating a trophy trout fishery where you just want a few really big cutthroat in there, or maybe you want a lake where you've got a whole bunch of cutthroats, and there's a really interesting spread. We'll talk a little bit more about sort of those survey reports that you publish here in a little bit. But it's interesting that there are lakes where there are very few caught, but the average size is a lot bigger. And I guess I'm curious, when you're managing the lakes, is it primarily angling and anglers that you're thinking about? Or are you thinking more about, just tell me what the factors are that go into that.
Yeah, so definitely a lot of it, it's a major part of it, is just recreational opportunity, to allow for the chance for anglers to make these hikes into these really beautiful places and to have a chance to catch a native fish to the state. So unless we'll have certain situations where we're managing for a native like conservation population. So in the Northeast, we're really focused on greenback cutthroat trout. They don't really get stocked into these alpine lakes in these situations for recreational opportunities, but there's some points where we're focusing on that. But a lot of these wilderness lakes, are just for recreational opportunities.
Really? And does that include lakes that are off trail? So some of my favorite places to go are places where you hike in on a trail and then you get off the trail and you know, bushwhack up the side of a mountain or through a forest or whatever, which I think is a lot of fun. I think a lot of people think that makes me an abnormal person, and they might be right. But is that true for those really remote lakes that are, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 miles off trail too?
Yeah, absolutely. We're trying to provide opportunity in the places that, even if, you know, maybe it only sees 5 to 10 anglers in a year, just to still give that chance for someone to catch a fish there. We've got, you know, lakes that we're stocking that are right off the trail in some really popular wilderness areas, and then some that are, you know, wilderness areas that don't see much visitation, and, you know, how many of them are actually anglers that are getting back there. So yeah, we're just trying to provide as many opportunities as we can.
Yeah, in general, if there's an alpine lake and it doesn't winter kill, it likely has been stocked by CPW or is self-sustaining with brook trout, which our ancestors put in. You know, there's another couple. A really good example is the Storm Lake complex, which is in the Indian Peaks. The lower Storm Lake has, you know, relatively decent cutthroat, 14 to 16 inches. But Gage forgot to mention he hiked into Upper Storm Lake, which is the highest elevation water in my area. I think it's close to 13,000 feet. And when Gage got there this year, it was 75% covered in ice. So right there, it tells me, you know, that's not a lake that we probably should send a pilot to, because when they're flying in there in early September, it's ice covered. And then subsequently, we put a gill net in there. We fished a little bit. We can't find any fish in that particular lake. So that's a unique opportunity, you know, for us to investigate places to put fish versus places that really aren't such a good idea. But I doubt that like Upper Storm Lake sees more than 100 people a year, and probably less than 10% of those are anglers heading up there. But we still look at those locations as potential places to put cutthroat.
So I was going to ask you about that. I love going to these really far out places, and I honestly I can't remember the last time I saw somebody else on one of those lakes. I mean, you'll see them on the ones that are right off a trail that have a name trail to them. I don't recall ever running into another angler at most of these places that are off trail, or even the ones that are at really high elevations. Do you keep statistics or data, or do you have a way to track how many people are fishing those places in a year or a decade? I'm always kind of curious about that, and I wonder if you have that info.
It's very difficult to track. We have some anecdotal evidence. A lot of our wildlife officers, particularly the more spry, the ones that are younger than me, will do treks into some of these high mountain lakes on weekends. They'll do maybe 2 or 3 different lakes a year. We can get some anecdotal evidence from that. We also do periodic surveys, just of our folks that are buying licenses, to see how many, what category are they in, warm water, cold water. Do you visit high mountain lakes? It's hard to track, but the investment from our hatcheries and the efficiency of the delivery to put these fish in the lake exceeds, you know, the cost, our cost. I mean, we're reaping more of the benefit, even though it may be a very limited number of anglers, because the folks like you that are willing to go to these high mountain lakes, you're not spending $5. You're spending, you know, a few $100s to buy the gear, get in there, and you know, outside of your fishing license and your gear, I mean, it's almost a priceless experience. So that's another reason we kind of, you know, behind why we stock some of these remote lakes.
That's amazing, because my favorite thing is taking the pictures. Sometimes I post them, sometimes I don't. But man, I'll sit there in bed at night and scroll back through the lakes that I've been to over the last 3 months or that summer, and those memories are awesome. And some of those lakes, particularly, I think I read somewhere that we've got 2,000 high lakes in Colorado or something like that. I might never be back to. I might only get there the one time, because there's so much other stuff to see, and having those memories is very cool. And knowing that some CPW pilot flew in there and dive bombed a bunch of fish into the lake so that I could catch them that one time that I go is pretty incredible. So Gage, let me ask you this. So you are, I think, the lucky one who is tasked with actually hiking in and doing the work on these lakes. Sometimes it's measurement, so making those bathymetric maps or whatever you happen to be doing, but also gill netting and then sampling with angling, which I think is an amazing way to say sneaking in some fly fishing for science while you're up there, which is incredible.
Exactly right.
So tell me about what one of these expeditions looks like. So when you're going to go out, are you going to a single lake? Do you try to sort of pin a whole bunch of them together in a week-long trip? How many people do you take? Like, walk me through one of these treks.
Yeah, so it starts with just a lot of research. So Ben will have provided me with a list of priority lakes, that for the entire year he wanted me to get to these, 50 lakes or so. And then from there, I'm going through and just researching these lakes, on Onyx maps and in our databases. When was the last time they've been sampled? When was the last time they've been stocked? How long they've been stocked for? What kind of notes there are from the last sampling event. Some of these haven't been sampled since 1972, or some have been being stocked and they've never been sampled. So starts with me doing that research, figuring out what are in there, what kind of fish have been in there, and then looking at Onyx and saying, well, these lakes are grouped together. It is reasonable to hit all these lakes in one trip. And so from there, I'm picking out how many people I need. So if there's 4 lakes in a basin, and that seems like what's most reasonable is just that basin, then we'll take, 2 people, and that's 2 gill nets a person, or gill net a person, depending on how many we're doing. For Ben, we were doing one 150-foot gill net per lake. So if we're doing 4 lakes, we probably would do 2 lakes a night and do a 2-night trip and set 2 lakes at a time, depending on, how far apart they were or on things like that. And so, yeah, so say it's me and one other person, and we get all our gear. We've got gill nets, we've got length boards and scales to sample our fish. We've got our personal angling gear, our camping gear, a belly boat to deploy the nets, sonar gear. A lot of times our backpacks are weighing up to 50 pounds or so. But yeah, we're making hikes into like a general area, somewhere that's kind of between all the lakes, somewhere we can access them all relatively easy from, setting up camp there. And then from there, we're going to set the nets in each lake. So if day 1 we're doing Jasper and Storm Lake, we will go up to those lakes, find a decent spot to set a net. We'll deploy our net with our belly boat, and then we'll also do sonar at that time. So we'll kick around the lake on our belly boat with that fish deeper sonar and kind of create a map with the map of the lake. And then from there, depending on our timing, we'll either fish for a while. And when we're fishing and we're catching fish, we're taking data and all that. So we're taking lengths and weights on each fish we catch, even if we're angling. And then from there, we'll move on to our next lake, go up there and repeat the whole process. Do the same thing. If that's kind of the end of our day, we'll either fish for a little bit longer. And then from there, we're heading back to camp, eating dinner, and setting up for the night. So, yeah, I'd say that's kind of how most of the trips worked out. I'd say most of them were 2 to 3 night trips. And we did that pretty much every week from the middle of June through the end of September. Middle of July through the end of September.
So how long are the gill nets out? Are they just out for one night per lake?
So we would try to set them try to keep it standardized. We'd try to do anywhere from 14 to 18 hours seemed to be our average right in the middle of there. So yeah, we'd try to set them in the afternoon at some point and then be pulling them pretty much first thing in the morning, depending on how far of a hike it is from our camp to where the lake is.
Okay. And I would assume that you're sort of timing, you said you start in July and you run through September. I just saw on the news yesterday that there's already first snow up there at the higher elevations here on, September 6th. So the season's kind of getting short on us. Talk to me about how you kind of prioritize the lakes. I'm sure you're doing it by elevation and by weather forecast, but when you have this big long list of 50 lakes, you know you've got this real short window from July until whenever the weather turns nasty in September. How are you prioritizing them by elevation and location? And curious about how you put that list together.
Yeah. So really the first thing that played into it was just how long ago it had been sampled. So if it was a lake that hadn't been sampled since 1970, then that immediately bumped it up really high on our priority list. From there, we kind of looked at elevation a little bit. That definitely plays into a decent amount. I feel like, in the towards the last couple of weeks of September, it definitely gets like hairy on what the weather could be. It's a toss up. But I feel like the other months didn't really have to worry about that as much. I feel like an afternoon thunderstorm was pretty much to be expected. But then from there, if we knew that a lake had brook trout at some point, that definitely bumped it up on our priority list because we want to see if we're stocking cutthroat into these lakes every other year, and we know there to have been brook trout in there in recent years or from the last sampling, we want to get in there and check that population to make sure that brook trout haven't just totally overrun the lake and, we've been dumping these cutthroat in there and there's not a single one and we're catching brook trout by the hundreds. So that is also a huge priority to see where we could potentially be wasting these resources when we're doing the aerial stocking.
Yeah, so let me ask you about the species side, and this is kind of a controversial one. So sorry about the controversial question, but I know that CPW stocks cutthroats into these lakes. They're called, in most of the documentation, native species cutthroats, and there is a sometimes heated, kind of as crazy as that is, disagreement in the angling community about whether or not we are allowed to call these things natives because they weren't in the lakes to begin with. We put them there, and they might be sort of a genetic hybrid between a couple different strains of cutthroats. I guess I'm curious about sort of how you come up with the species that you're going to put in those lakes, and when we're catching a cutthroat, particularly in those really high lakes, what kind of fish are we touching? What are we taking pictures of?
They're in the most pure sense, they are a native cutthroat. But earlier I mentioned how our ancestors were carrying fish across the Continental Divide. We had the Colorado River cutthroat and the greenback cutthroat. We had the Rio Grande in the southeast. So over the years, our populations that were in our streams and some of our lakes, although they were native cutthroat, they were not pure Colorado River or pure East Slope greenbacks because of the genetics got convoluted. And we have an understanding or a memorandum of agreement with the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service to only stock some strain of cutthroat in high mountain lakes. Particularly in wilderness, we're not allowed to stock generic rainbows, splake, tiger trout. We're not allowed to stock brown trout. So they're cutthroat, but they're not the purest of what matches the genetics of what we know to be a pure greenback or a pure Colorado River cutthroat. But next, it can be controversial, but we're also working on the other end that Gage alluded to. We have populations on the landscape of the pure original greenback cutthroat in Zimmerman Lake, drainages to Clear Creek. We're working on Herman Gulch. We're working on Williams Gulch. We're working on Slater Lake. We're working on several locations to expand the actual boots on the ground and the real cutthroat, the real deal in locations that are feasible for us to get to with equipment and reintroduce the original species. In order for us to potentially reintroduce the real greenback in like a high mountain lake that's 6 miles off the trailhead is just not realistic. We need to haul in several hundred pounds of equipment to do a reclamation. So their genetics are convoluted, but they look like cutthroat. They taste like cutthroat. They behave like cutthroat, and they take a darn good photograph.
They do. They're beautiful fish, and to be honest with you, I get a little bit annoyed and roll my eyes at the argument because they're very pretty cutthroat, and they're obviously cutthroat. So, I admire the greenback restoration efforts. I've fished in Herman Gulch, and have been kind of all over those places. It's great, but I also love catching those cutthroats up in the High-Alpine lakes as well. So, as far as brook trout and rainbows go, so Ben, you mentioned that you have an agreement that says you can't stock those in certain wilderness lakes. I'm curious about how you sort of define a wilderness lake. So when you're looking at the lakes where you can't drop any more brookies or you can't drop any more rainbows, is there an elevation limit? Is it certain?
No, I mean it's designated a wilderness area.
Okay.
So, for example, I manage the Indian Peaks Wilderness, and then also the James Peak Wilderness. You can't bring in anything mechanical, so no generators, no ATVs. Like I said, no equipment to do a reclamation in the wilderness areas. So our understanding with the Forest Service is we will no longer introduce anything other than a cutthroat that has gone through rigorous testing for diseases. It's not carrying whirling disease. It's not carrying bacterial kidney disease. It's gone through microscopic genetic testing that these are not going to cause problems because they're so high up in the drainage. They're not going to filter down and spread disease. So they're a little bit more rigorously tested compared to some of our run-of-the-mill 10-inch catchable trout that might get stocked in some of the kids' ponds or metro lakes in Denver seasonally. These fish have gone through quite a bit of testing before they're stocked. But yeah, those two designations are. I mean, there's a variety of wilderness areas in Colorado. I guess another way of looking at it is, Rocky Mountain National Park is kind of its own entity and another, I guess, different type of wilderness. But it's just a designation. I think it was Roosevelt that led the charge to do a lot of the wilderness area designations, and we're trying to follow suit by not, making the problem worse by spreading disease or spreading for more non-native species. And one of the things we didn't mention is if we find brook trout, we're taking that lake off the stocking schedule because they outcompete the cutthroat, and it's dangerous stocking these high mountain lakes with cutthroats. So that was one of the main reasons I needed Gage to go through all of these lakes. Is like, let's once and for all try to visit 60 or 80 of these lakes in the 2-year season. Get the lakes that are overrun with brook trout off the stocking schedule. Let's most efficiently use our cutthroats and eliminate some of these waters where we don't need the pilot to take a risk.
That's interesting. I've always kind of wondered about how you handle those lakes that have both brookies and cutthroats. I've been to a few this summer where I've caught both, and you're right, there always tend to be more brookies because they're obviously a little bit more competitive. Is there a specific threshold? So when you send Gage up there to check these things out, you gill net, you catch a few cutthroats, and you catch a certain number of brookies. Is there a threshold that you use to decide when you're not going to stock that lake anymore? So is it, you catch one brookie and you're out, or is it 10, or how do you decide when it's reached that?
Each lake's a little different, but generally, if it's a 50-50 mix, we'll keep it on the stocking schedule. But once it gets tipped towards the brook trout, it's usually going to go eventually to 80-90% brook trout. So anything over the 50-50, I guess, threshold will probably take off the aerial stocking schedule.
So why are the brook trout so much more, well, I shouldn't say suited because obviously they're not from here, but why do they outcompete the cutthroats as badly as they do?
They reproduce in lakes considerably better than a cutthroat. They can find the smallest crevice of an inflow and drop their eggs even on fine gravel, to the point where I've seen reproduction over silt. The cutthroat needs much cleaner water or clearer water, a bigger stretch of stream to actually reproduce. The other one, the brook trout are WD resistant. they can thrive in areas where whirling disease has been introduced. Cutthroat cannot survive any sort of impacts from whirling disease. Brook trout are fall spawners. They can have a larger variety of temperature, I guess, ranges to pull off a spawn. The cutthroat need a smaller window. They're spring spawners. So their nests, if they're able to build a nest in a lake that has a small stream, may be blown out by spring runoff, whereas the brook trout don't have to worry about that. There's just a variety of things that are stacked up against the native cutthroat that, don't make the conditions ideal for natural reproduction. And probably the biggest one is, before Colorado was settled, there were no fall spawning trout in Colorado. Now we have fall spawning lake trout. Now we have fall spawning brown trout. We've got the brooks. Now, they were never in competition with those three species, and now they are.
So when somebody goes up to one of these lakes and catches brook trout, and I'll come out and say that I love brook trout. I know they're not native, and I know they can be problematic, but man, they are really, really pretty. And they'll eat just about anything you put in front of them in a lot of places, which is awesome. But there's a debate that happens online quite a bit. If you post a picture of a brook trout and you're from Colorado, you'll have 15 people hop on there and say, "Oh man, you got to throw that thing in the woods. It's non-native. It's an invasive species. Get it out of here." And is there any official advice from CPW about how anglers ought to handle brook trout? I'm 100% CNR. I actually don't even really like the way trout taste, so I have no interest in eating them. But I like to catch them, and I always put them back. I've always kind of wondered if there's official guidance or thoughts on what we should do with brook trouts. Keep in mind that, everybody's got their own opinion on this subject.
Yeah, it's certainly personal preference. We certainly don't recommend waste. Catching a fish and throwing it in the woods, certainly we don't recommend that. But, you can harvest up to 4 of them, and then 8 bonus brook trout under 8 inches. And we encourage people to harvest, hone their cooking skills, do a little practice on your backcountry camping and cooking. In addition to your fishing, bring some seasoning, bring some butter, try it out. It only takes a little bit of tinfoil, or bring it home with you and try it out. They're here to stay, and we will manage around them in locations, like Herman Gulch and Zimmerman. We will manage around their presence, and hopefully, they can coexist to a level where we can accomplish our goal of conservation, but also accomplish the goal of recreation for the angler. So they're here to stay. Don't throw them in the woods. Go ahead and eat them, or, let them go. So it's personal preference. There really is no official stance on it, other than, if you're keeping a fish and you just throw it in a trash can, that's considered, waste of the resource.
Agree completely. How about the cutthroat? So I know, again, I let them all go. I want to take my pictures and, touch them a little bit in the net, and I let them go back home so somebody else can catch them. I know occasionally, especially in those real remote lakes, folks are obviously harvesting and keeping them for dinner. What are the limits, or what are the rules to be aware of when it comes to cutthroat harvest in those high alpine lakes?
Generally, the regulations are 4 fish in aggregate. So you could have a combination of 2 cutthroat or 2 brook trout, or 4 cutthroat. And we manage these lakes for harvest. We'll put more in. The harvest is actually pretty minimal, especially over the last 30 years. Mentality has really changed. Most folks are out there to enjoy the outdoors, enjoy the scenery, take photos, and harvesting fish has actually become secondary to all the things I previously mentioned. So taking home and harvesting an occasional fish is not going to harm the overall fishery. And frankly, we encourage it, because we've got hatcheries backing us up. We'll figure out if is there an impact to this fishery based on harvest. Well, we can change things. We can change fishing regulations. We can change the stocking regime. So I don't think people should hesitate at all to harvest and, consume some of these fish.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people enjoy it. Maybe one day I'll do what you recommended and actually figure out how to cook. I'm always eating freeze dried junk that I have in the bottom of my backpack when I'm out there. Maybe I should upgrade my game. But so, Ben, let me ask you this. You mentioned how the outdoor universe has kind of changed. Obviously, there are a ton more people in Colorado than there used to be. There are a lot more people fly fishing than there used to be. And I feel, I might be wrong about this. I don't have any statistics to back it up, but I feel like there is an increase in the number of anglers who are, they're tired of fishing in deckers. They don't want another guy standing on top of them. They want to go start getting out into what I would consider to be these backcountry areas, sometimes streams, often lakes. And the traffic is increasing, right? I don't see people in the really remote lakes, but every now and then I'll be at a lake that's 6 or 7 miles into a trail, and I run into a couple folks who are up there on the tundra doing their thing. And I guess I'm curious from a wildlife management perspective and sort of an environmental management perspective. Have you noticed an increase in traffic, and then have you noticed an impact on the ecosystems in those high alpine lakes?
Based off of our survey data, no impacts to the fishery. But I mean, anecdotal evidence, it's obvious. There's more people using our high mountain lakes than ever. But for the most part, people are respectful. They understand the environment is fragile, and I mean, it's hard to put any statistics on high mountain lake use, but it's obvious. Yes, we have more folks. Is it having an impact yet on the fisheries? I would say no.
That's good to know. I know a lot of people kind of stress about that, and we're all fishermen, so it is kind of like you discover a new place and you go up there and you see another guy and you sort of are like, oh man, I thought this was my place, but I'm glad to know that it's not impacting the ecology of them. Be interesting to see if that changes as the population keeps growing. But on that same note of kind of how people find these things, I know earlier on, Gage, you were talking about using OnX. I use that same app. I love it. In fact, I literally will not go out without it. It has probably saved my life more than a few times. But I know there are a lot of folks who they want to do high alpine lakes. They want to go fish and see these places, but they don't really know how to find them. They don't know how to find out about the lakes. They don't know how to check trail systems. Even though CPW is publishing really helpful data on, survey results and stocking reports and all of that, you kind of don't know where to start. So if you're an angler and you want to go take advantage of one of these lakes that you've stocked for the benefit of anglers, where do you start? How do you start finding these lakes? How do you start getting out to fish them?
Yeah, I'll hop in on that one. I'd say the first is just get on the internet. We have all the info we can get is at the tip of our fingers on our phone. So yeah, searching, if you're looking at a lake in a wilderness, search that wilderness name, Indian Peak Wilderness. And if you had CPW on the end of that search, you might find a survey summary that we've posted. You might find blogs that other people have posted that have gone and fished and posted about. Doing as much research as you can online of just search a lake name. Starting from there, that's like huge. I think just to give you any background info on if there's fish in there, if people are fishing it, the access to get to it. And then, yeah, I would agree with you on OnX Maps. I think is one of the most amazing tools to use for the outdoors. We use that to map out all our trips that we did, and I think it gives you a great way to just be able to find lakes on there that you would probably never be able to make it to without a map that you had in your hands. And then, yeah, using that to just pick a lake, and after you've done your research, the next biggest thing is just putting in the effort. Most of these lakes you got to try pretty hard for. So just being willing to put in that effort, be in good enough shape to do it, and giving it your all to hike to a lake and hopefully catch some fish.
So when you're researching the lake and you are trying to decide if there are fish in it, where would you go to get access to a survey report or the most recent survey data from CPW? Is there a central place where folks can go to grab that? Is it just on the website?
Yeah, we all the data that Gage collected last year is online. It's kind of unique for my area. A lot of the other biologists have not had the luxury of having an associate biologist like Gage in their district that's been able to get to all these high mountain lakes. But I think it's my responsibility to share with what we found. So on the CPW website, one caveat, Ross, is our website's going under an overhaul. So it's not available right now, but for the past decade, the results from our high mountain lake surveys is on there. And you can find out are there brook trout, are there cutthroat, is it 50-50 mix, what's the size range, max weight, max length, and that's all available online along with some great photos. And we don't really have hiking advice or how strenuous the trail is. We're going to leave that up to the individual angler, to go to your local, outdoor store and get a quality map or use the Onyx programs or research it online. But we kind of give the angler the information in terms of what species and where can I go to get after it. I mean, we do have lakes in the high country that even have lake trout or splake. They're few and far between. There's a couple, if you do your research, and I'm not going to say where they are, there's a couple that have golden trout. If you do your research, put the time in, you'll find these hidden gems, hopefully. And I know a lot of anglers don't like to share their particular secrets, but we're in the business of sharing what we find when we go to a public high mountain lake.
And I'll add on to that too. Another great application is All Trails. It's a free app that you can use on your phone, and most hikes are named by the lake that they go to. So you can search, Blue Lake Trail, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of what that route looks like. That's not going to work for a lot of these unnamed lakes that are off trails, but for a large majority and a lot of those really popular wilderness areas, you're going to be able to find a lot of information on that website about the trail and access to get to those lakes. So elevation, climb, and distance, and people can leave reviews on those trails.
Yeah, All Trails is really pretty good. And sometimes it's got stuff on it that Onyx doesn't. Sometimes Onyx has stuff on it that All Trails doesn't, and it's a good idea to have more than one. And that's
absolutely. Yeah, I used that pretty consistently when we were. I forgot to mention that when we were planning these trips out. I used All Trails quite a bit.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And then do just a quick safety note: do bring a paper map and a compass, and know how to use those things. It's especially if you're going to go wander off up the side of a mountain. They just found a couple of hikers dead this last week, which is very sad. Mm-hmm. Bring multiple navigation devices. Know what you're doing. Go get the training that you need to do it safely if you need to do that.
Absolutely.
But be thoughtful about it. So as far as fishing goes, going back to something you said earlier, Gage, with regard to kind of the timing of these lakes. So, I mean, a lot of them I think people sometimes get stuck because alpine lakes run on a different schedule than most of our low country lakes and streams, where, a lot of them are frozen until like the 4th of July. And some of them are frozen until late August. There are a couple lakes that I like to go to where you might get a week every year where you can possibly get up there and have open water and get after them. But what would you recommend as far as, advice for folks who want to go do this? They have this short window of time from July 1st to maybe September 15th or maybe September 30th, depending on how the weather goes. But as far as how they prioritize getting up to the lakes, what's your advice for them? Do you have a sense of when they ought to visit certain lakes or lakes at certain elevations, and kind of how that changes over the course of the summer?
Yeah. Doing your research right off the bat will help in just giving you the time to spend your time with boots on the ground going towards those lakes. Personally, I love the month of August to fish these high mountain lakes. I feel like July, right around ice off, I feel like sometimes those fish are attempting to spawn, even though they don't really pull off a spawn. They're attempting to spawn, and they're not really focused on trying to eat quite yet. And then it seems like, and this is all just my personal preference and kind of my thoughts, but just seems like right after they come out of that spawn, then they're hungry and ravenous from, overwintering under the ice, not a whole bunch of food, spending all that energy trying to spawn. seems like right after that, those fish are hot and ready to eat anything that you put in front of them. And then again, even from August into September, as it starts to cool off again, the temperature's cooling off, it's getting snow, rain up in the High-Alpine. I think these fish are starting to gear up for the winter. So they're trying to put on as much fat, trying to eat as much as they can before the ice comes on again, and then they're slowing down. So I think they're trying to put on as much as they can and grow as much as they can. And so that makes, I think, the fishing pretty good also.
Yeah, so that piece about the spawning, I'm glad you said that. It took me years to figure that out. Alpine lakes have this sort of reputation of being these mystical places where sometimes you go and there are fish, and sometimes you go and the trout are just not going to look. It doesn't matter what fly you have on. It doesn't matter what you're doing. They're just not going to look at it. And there was a time where I was just pretty convinced that I was either the worst angler in the world, which might be true. That could still be true. Or that, there was just something that I was missing. And I think the thing that I was missing was that spawn behavior. Because you'll sometimes go up to these lakes. A lot of them they may be pretty deep, but they have a shelf across the edge, and the cutthroats will cruise in there looking for food. And sometimes they'll be sitting there and you're looking at like a 20-inch amazing red-bellied cutthroat, and you cycle through 1,500 flies in your boxes and he just will not look at it. And I think that turns some people off. They kind of decide it's too hard. These alpine lakes are too finicky, and they give up and just go back to fishing the streams. But I think that's important. It's a timing thing. You can definitely be too early to some of those lakes, and even if the ice is off, the fish might not be eating. So the more that folks do this, I think the more you'll get a sense for the rhythm of those lakes. They're all a little different. The ones at Timberline down at 11,000 feet obviously warm up faster. They're on a different schedule than those lakes that are at like 12 or 12.5 or even 13 that might still be frozen in late August. And getting out there and checking it out, I think, is the right way to do it. But if they're not eating, it might be your fault, but it might not be your fault.
Yeah.
People keeping that in mind.
For sure. So a lot of times if I see cutthroat chasing each other in the shallows, then I know that it's probably going to be pretty tough fishing.
But then you've got the gill nets, right? We don't all have gill nets with us, so at least you still get to look at them at the end.
We still get to take some awesome pictures of them out of the gill net, for sure.
That's cool. All right, so a couple questions for you just for fun. What is the biggest cutthroat you've ever sampled in one of these lakes? And this is for both of you guys. I'm curious to know your personal best, gill net or angling.
Definitely all mine probably came out of a gill net. But we had a 22-inch cutthroat that had a 15-inch girth. It looked like a football. I've never seen another cutthroat like that. It was a freak of nature, I'd say, but it was one of the most beautiful fish, but also, just absurdly sized.
Yeah, Gage has got me beat. He's got more hours of sampling time now after doing this for 2 years as I've got in my 19 years. Like I said, I only used to get to like 4 lakes a year, but it's quality, or it's quantity over quality in these high mountain lakes. It's more, you're looking more, catching higher numbers of 12 to 14-inch fish versus your trophies. But if you do your research, there's particular lakes in the wilderness areas, like the one Gage was talking about, or didn't mention the name, that do have some of these 18 to 22-inch masterpieces. Personally, I maxed out at an 18-inch fish. I believe that came out of Heart Lake. I don't think it's too big a surprise that there's trophy fish in Heart. But I've also ran into an evening where, I caught 24, 12-inch cutthroat. And I don't know, there's just a variety. You just got to pick your lake. And I don't know, would you rather catch 24 12-inch fish or one 22-inch? I don't know. That's the opportunity we're trying to give folks. Pick your poison.
Yeah, and honestly, it's all great. I spend most of my life catching small fish. I love small streams. I love creeks, and I'll catch 8-inch brook trout all day and be a happy catcher. Right. It doesn't bother me at all. But it is cool when you catch those big fish that surprise you, especially up there. If you catch a let's say an 18-inch or a 20-inch cutthroat on one of those lakes, and I know this depends on elevation and some other factors, but how old is that fish? How long has he been in there to get to that size?
General, I mean, a 20-inch cutthroat has been in there at least 8 years. The trout will double in size up to like age 3 or 4, and then they really slow down. But each lake is dependent on the productivity, the depth at which the sunlight penetrates. But yeah, that your larger fish, are your 6 to 8 plus year olds, particularly the 22-inch cutthroat. Their lifespan rarely gets to 10, but that fish that I saw that Gage sent me a picture of was around 8 years old.
I haven't found that 22-inch one yet. I'm looking forward to that day. Maybe one day I'll find him. But all right, last bonus question. Do you have any crazy stories from surveying one of these lakes that stick out in your mind? Maybe a crazy storm or a moose rampage. I'm just curious for the craziest thing that's happened when you're whacking out to these far off backcountry lakes.
Yeah, I've definitely had some cool animal encounters. Woken up to elk bugling outside our camp, climbing up scree fields right next to our camp. Like there's a herd of elk that, I could hear. I was in my tent in the dark before the morning, and could hear these elk scrambling around in these rocks, and peek out the tent, and they're like just going up the scree field. I've walked up to bull moose on a trail within 20 feet where I come around a corner and they're staring at me. So some crazy things like that. I've been in some storms at 12,000 feet where we were stuck and really didn't have any option of getting out of there. Pretty crazy lightning and thunder. Me and the coworker I was with were able to, the first hour of the storm, I think we were in good spirits, kind of laughing, joking around, still taking cover under a tree. And, 2 hours later, it's still happening. And then it's starting to get a little scary. It's like, crap, like we really have no way out of here in some crazy thunder without really risking some stuff. So yeah, that's a great thing with the paying attention to in the backcountry is watching those storms, because it can definitely change in an instant, and you really need to probably be better prepared than we were for that one. So I think that covers it for a lot of the crazy stuff. Definitely saw a lot of really big moose, bull moose. That time of year, it seems like those moose are really up in those alpine areas. So that's a really cool kind of side bonus to see some nice moose. Didn't have any run-ins with any bears or mountain lions or anything. So kind of wish I did, but still thankful that I didn't. So, but yeah, no, we definitely had a really good time over the last 2 summers doing all this work.
Awesome. Yeah, I know those storms are, like you said, they're fun for a little while, and I've tried to ride out a couple of them, but sometimes they last for 4 or 5 hours, and that's not as fun.
Yeah, it's pretty disappointing when they blow in that fast, but then they don't leave that fast, and you're stuck in them. It's kind of crazy how that can happen.
Well, yeah, especially in the afternoon, because then it starts getting dark on you, and you don't know if you can get back down. Don't mess with thunderstorms. It's cool until it's not. That's true for sure. What about you, Ben? Any crazy stories? You've been doing it for a long time.
I'll certainly have some interesting stories, but I think I'm glad you brought it up, Ross, about the safety. I think this is a lighthearted conversation, and we've really geared talking about fish and fishing, but yeah, the weather can change so darn fast, and the temperature fluctuations are pretty crazy. We've gone from 80 degrees at 12,000 feet to getting snowed on. Kind of worried about getting down, but and then the other one, it was just I made the mistake of going off trail on the side of a slope that was 45 degrees and trying to kick in without crampons or anything like that, and looking down is like, God, that was stupid. Going off trail, not a great idea. Lightheartedly, we've had marmots in our tents. That was very interesting. We've had to dodge moose while packing in fish that are caretakers of young. So be aware of that. We've jumped behind rocks before and come across, wildlife that didn't expect us. But luckily, I've never had a run-in with a predator like a mountain lion or a bear. But I certainly have a soft spot in my heart for marmots now. So, yeah, just get out and enjoy these lakes. But, yeah, please use some caution.
Yeah, be safe. I mean, I have run into mountain lions. I'm actually okay if I never do that again. It wasn't my favorite experience. And it's cool to see. It's cool to see the moose. It's cool to see the marmots. I don't know that I have as good of a relationship with the marmots as you do, Ben. They kind of drive me nuts, but they are cute. But do it safely. I think it's worth noting, these high lakes, especially lakes above timber, they're beautiful. They're awesome memories, as we said earlier. But they don't care about you. The weather doesn't care about you. The animals don't care about you. The terrain doesn't care about you. You can go from having a real good time and building some cool memories to being in pretty serious danger pretty quickly. So safety is definitely always got to be first. And I appreciate you mentioning that. So yeah, thank you guys for joining. Really appreciate this. It was super fascinating. I actually learned a lot. So thanks for making time to come on and chat with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate getting some of this information out there and, helping anglers get on some of these really cool lakes out that we have.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique resource that, frankly, a lot of anglers don't even know is out there. They're hard to get to, but, it's really rewarding. Let's just put it that way, Ross.
That's the best word for it. Well, thank you guys. Take care.
All right.
Thank you. You too.
Good night.
All right, that'll do for today. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Ben Swigle and Gage Dean, who were here to help us really understand High-Alpine lakes and how Colorado Parks and Wildlife manages those lakes. I found it to be a super fascinating conversation. I learned a ton. I think you probably did too, and hopefully you had fun with it. So be safe out there, and I'll see you again soon. Until next time, this is Ross, and maybe I'll see you out there. But hopefully not.